Hi everyone. It's about 3 o'clock my time, so I guess we will get started. Welcome to today's Peanut Labs webinar. My name is Annie Pettit, and I am the Chief Research Officer of Peanut Labs, a company that specializes in self-serve sampling. Thanks a bunch for taking the time to join me today. For the next 25 minutes or so, I'm going to share some research we've done into how people communicate in social media. It's being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it later if you like. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to type them into the question box at the side, and I'll see how many of those questions I can get to at the end of the presentation. If you're having any trouble hearing me, also just leave a quick note in the box and I'll see if I can help you out at that point. Alrighty, so let's get going. A lot of the research we do is to discover demographic differences. So how do the opinions of older people differ from the opinions of younger people? Or more educated versus less educated people? And of course, how do the opinions of men differ from those of women? However, how do you know when the differences you find are real differences due to the product or service that you're evaluating, or due to inherent differences between men and women? Maybe men and women like something the exact same amount, but they use different words to describe it. And that's what I'm going to look into today. So when it comes to traditional research, we've spent a lot of time listening and learning how people speak. We've sat down with people in focus groups and we've watched men and women talk. We've seen the expressions on their faces, their body movements, and we've really learned how to judge the sentiment of words that men and women use when they're talking. But so much qualitative research is being conducted online now. We can't see people's faces. We don't always see their body movements. What we're really seeing is words on the page. So we have a problem. It can be very difficult to tell whether the word choices that different groups have are because of the product or because of the demographics. So here's the study we did. We created 5 really boring, really huge data sets from social media data. Instead of collecting data on a brand like Nike, traditionally a guy's brand, or KitchenAid, traditionally a girl's brand, we collected social media data based on unbranded, generic, grammatical words. So we gathered 1 million verbatims that use the word the, and another 1 million verbatims using the word that. This way we could make sure that we weren't collecting verbatims that were gender or age dependent. These data sets would be purely grammatical and demographically unbiased. So this data would tell us what people actually write online. Now we also collected another set of data, much smaller this time, using a survey. 300 U.S. Census Rep completes. So this data would be used to tell us what people think about what they write online. And we all know that what people say can be extremely different than what people do. So we want to be able to measure what people are actually doing and what they think about what they're doing. So let's get into some results. Now, one of the first things that people think about when they think of social media verbatims is sentiment. So not surprisingly, that was one of the first things we looked at. Now, across the 5 social media data sets and across the millions of verbatims that we collected, we did see that men and women differ in their, in their sentiment. Women did indeed choose more positive words, such as love, awesome, and help, while men did indeed choose more negative, aggressive words like fight, argue, and idiot. Now, this does not mean that women don't use negative words and that men don't use positive words. It just means there is a slight tendency for women to use the positive words a bit more than men do. So when we're analyzing social media verbatims, we need to remember that men inherently use more negative words. We can't assume that men are more negative about something just because they say they dislike the product or service. Men are just naturally more negative to begin with. We also looked at the use of slang in social media. We started by asking people in the survey how often they use slang in social media versus in real life. And it's quite interesting to see the difference here. People are much more likely to say they never use slang online, and they're much more likely to say they use slang all the time offline. So think of this difference in terms of conducting research. In this sense, people say they're much more likely to use slang in a live focus group as opposed to an online focus group. So let's look at what actually happens online. Again, we see a difference between how men and women express themselves in social media. We can see that women are more likely to use the letter C for the word see, and to use the letters L-U-V for the word love. On the other hand, men are more likely to use D-A-T for the word that, and gotta instead of have got to. Now what's interesting here is there are very specific differences between men and women. Men seem to be combining words together, like gotta and gonna, whereas women are simply shortening words, like people and love. Do remember, these differences are slight. You can't just assume that anyone who uses the word D-A-T is a guy. So next we looked at profanity. So think about your own use of social media as we go through this. First in the survey, we asked people about mild profanity. That would be words like hell, damn, dang. A lot of people confess to using these words a fair amount in the offline world. There's a lot less stigma to them, and even though they can pull a punch, you can usually get away without offending people. But you can see that people are careful about using them in social media. Now, even though these are generally acceptable words, people do confess to using them less often in social media than in real life. But if we ask people about their use of harsh profanity, those would be the typical words like the F word that I can't say here. The trend changes quite a bit. Far fewer people admit to using these words either offline or online, but you can clearly see that people are much more hesitant to use harsh profanity online. And I think the reason for that is fairly simple. If you swear in real life, the word is said and it's forgotten. There's no record of it. It's not burned for eternity in someone's brain. But in social media, that word is there forever. You could search for my name and see exactly when and where I've used any profanity online. You could then decide that I'm not very professional if you see I swear a lot. You could decide not to hire me for a job based on how much profanity you've seen me use in social media. So clearly a lot of people are very careful to make sure their swear words aren't searchable. When we look at what people actually do, and I'm sure some of you are chuckling right now, oh, there's swear words on the screen. You will see there's an interesting difference between men and women here. Women are more likely to use the mild profanity in social media. And I'll confess, I do use the words dang or darn online. If you do an internet search, you will find that I've used those words. And I'm not terribly worried about these words. I don't think they'll jeopardize my employability. On the other hand, men are more likely to use the extreme words, the harsh profanity. You can search all you like, but you won't find me using those words in a regular conversation. You may find me using them as part of research on research like this, but you just won't be able to find it as part of a casual conversation. And those who are joining us, this is a lovely slide to join on. All right, on to acronyms. Now, when we ask people how they use acronyms online and offline, people do say that they use acronyms more online, and this is understandable. You wouldn't listen to your friend tell you a joke and then say, LOL. You'd be laughing. You'd actually be laughing. And you wouldn't be saying, BTW, I have class tonight. You'd just say, by the way, I have class tonight. And of course, many of us can think faster than we can type, which means acronyms help our fingers keep up with our brains. And for those of us who use Twitter, we are constantly remembering to keep our chatter as short as possible because we only have 140 characters to work with. You've got to save whatever space you can, and that means using acronyms. When we look at what people actually do online, we can see that women are more likely to use acronyms like WTF and SMH. And on that note, I am sure some of you are wondering what SMH stands for. That's simply shaking my head in disapproval, in dismay. Anyways, what's interesting about the use of acronyms is that you can see women are more likely to use WTF and LMAO. Now, women might be less likely to use profanity online, but these are two cases where the acronyms let them use profanity. Now, I did a quick Google search for myself using one of these acronyms, and I did find a WTF. So apparently, I will swear as long as it's part of an acronym. I will also admit that I am a bit of a grammar Nazi, so I did have to check a few of my pet peeves. So I looked at how often people wrote woman that instead of women who. And I also checked the use of would of versus would have. Then I checked whether people knew a lot was actually two words, not just one. And of course, I had to check whether people knew how to use the words you are and your. So what you see here is that men were a bit better in their use of grammar. They are more likely to know that a lot was two words and that the word man should be followed by who, not that. And sadly, women were more likely to say women that instead of women who, as well as would of instead of would have. So let's move on to a little bit of laziness now. One of the simplest things you can do when you're typing online is to leave out apostrophes. Most words won't lose any meaning if you do this, and it also saves a full character space, so Twitter users will like it. And if you're on a mobile phone, it even saves you, a lot of you, the hassle of switching character keyboards just to choose an apostrophe. And that can take as much time as writing a whole sentence. So I know I've done that, particularly at conferences when I'm trying to tweet and listen at the same time. So we've got a good percentage of people who say they never do this online. But we've got about 20% of people who say they drop apostrophes all the time, like me. So let's look at the data and see where men and women actually stand on this. So this one's pretty clear. Word for word, men are more inclined to drop the apostrophe. Perhaps it's being efficient, perhaps they're fussing with terrible mobile phones. In the end though, if I think about myself, it's probably just a whole lot of laziness. Now, something else we can look at in terms of how people write online is who they talk about. As we see here, women are more likely to reference themselves with the words me, my, or I. Women are also more likely to reference groups of people, including themselves, such as we or our. On the other hand, men are more likely to talk about other people, and specifically other men. So they'll talk about you or your as well as his or himself. Now again, take this back to a focus group. In a focus group, are women talking more about themselves, whereas men are talking more about other men? It's an interesting difference to be aware of when you're trying to figure out if a demographic difference is because of the method used to conduct the research, or because of inherent demographic differences, or if it truly is the product or service difference. This is the inherent demographic difference that we need to be aware of going into research. Now, when it comes to talking about the family, women again are much more likely to use family words. They're more likely to use words like brother, sister, dad, mom, kids. They inherently talk more about the members of the family. On the other hand, men are more likely to talk about men. So when we read what women say online, it's natural for them to talk more about family members than men do. You can't simply assume that it's the product that is making women talk more about their family members. It's just one of the ways that women talk in social media. So here is what we're all interested in, because really the vast majority of marketing research is all about what products and services consumers will spend their money on. So here we see that women are more likely to use words like bought, purchase, deals, donate. And on the other hand, men are more likely to use words like taxes, credit, price, and cheap. And if you think about these words a bit, you can see that women are using words to indicate that they already bought something on sale, that they've saved money. But on the other hand, men are using words to say that they're focused on getting a cheap price. They're looking at specific dollars and cents. It's a slight difference, but it's an important distinction to keep in mind when you're evaluating how men and women are talking about your product. This is how men and women always talk, not just about your product, but about every product. You'll need to see huge differences in this area if you want to claim a true product difference between the genders. Now, also very important to us are the basic research measurements. If you look at any marketing research survey, these are the questions you'll see. How likely are you to try, recommend, vote, of whether for someone or something? Is this thing new or different? These are extremely important measurements. And what we see here is that women are more likely to talk about trying, waiting, and new things. But on the other hand, men are more likely to talk about recommending, voting, and different. So men want to critique things while women want to try things. Again, it's an important distinction to be aware of when you're reading verbatims from men and women. This is how the genders are inherently different. So when you see these differences, these are normal, natural. You can't simply assume you're seeing any differences because of your product. Again, you need to see large differences in these areas if you want to say for sure that it is because of your product. So what we've seen so far, men are more likely to combine words, use aggressive words to talk about men, and women are more likely to shorten words, use positive words, and talk about themselves. These are some basic gender differences, and indeed some of these we would expect based on traditional stereotypes. But the grammar and acronym usage is certainly something that's new and certainly brought out by this new era of social media. Now let's take a very quick look at some age differences. Now, similar to what we looked at with gender, we can compare how younger people write in social media with how older people write in social media. And here we see that younger people are more likely to talk about their mothers. Maybe that's not surprising, as everyone loves their mom. Younger people are also more likely to use aggressive words like fight, as well as profanity, including the big swear words. And younger people are less inclined to care about grammar, and they use acronyms and slang a lot. This makes sense as they've grown up with social media and they've learned that saving time and space is really important in that environment. And of course, the older folks, they're much less inclined to use profanity, poor grammar, and acronyms. There are some very clear age differences. So as we saw before, there are inherent differences between how older and younger people communicate in social media. And when we see these kinds of differences in relation to a brand, we have to remember that these are inherent differences. We need to look for very large demographic differences or differences that are reversed from what we'd expect before we can attribute them to the brand. So we clearly saw that there are differences between how people communicate offline and online. In our survey, we asked people about a number of personality characteristics that might define how they behave online and offline. And you can see here that people were more likely to claim that they keep to themselves, they're shy, and they have few friends when they're offline. On the other hand, more people are likely to say that they are careful about what they say online and they have lots of friends online. Specifically, people do admit that they behave differently when they're online versus online. So quiet people might be less quiet online, and people who have few offline friends might have many online friends. In other words, what we know from how people behave in an offline focus group isn't necessarily going to be how they behave in an online focus group. So here you see a few verbatims from the survey. If I was going to show you social media verbatims, I'd have to change some of the spelling mistakes or change some punctuation, so you couldn't just Google a verbatim and find the person. But since these are survey verbatims and you can't search for them online, I can show you exactly what people wrote. You see here that people are quite conscious of their use of profanity. They don't want employers to see them in a bad light. And they also recognize that they are much more likely to blurt things out in real life without thinking them through. So communicating online slows you down and makes you take more care with the words you choose. And I see this in myself very much so. In real life, I'll say pretty much anything, but online, it gives me time to think about what I want to say, choose the right words, change my phrasing, and get it just so before I release it into perpetuity for Google to always be able to search out. Here are a few more verbatims for you. Again, you can see very clearly that people recognize there is a difference between how they communicate online versus in real life. For some people, going online helps them communicate more, whereas for other people, they have to tone back to who they really are. So there's a lot of self-censoring going on. There's a lot of dual personalities fine-tuned for the online world and the offline world. We do have to make sure that we don't apply our offline stereotypes to the online world. So based on what we've seen so far, it's clear that there are inherent demographic differences between how men and women communicate online. The differences are slight. You can't just go out there and say men are this, women are this. The differences are slight, but they are there. And what it means is when we see these kinds of differences showing up in branded research, we need to make sure that they're very strong differences or that the differences are reversed. When that happens, we know it's a difference caused by the brand and not by inherent demographic differences that people have when they communicate in writing in social media. So that leaves us with just one last question to answer. Are women from Venus and men from Mars? Well, from the millions of verbatims that we gathered, we were able to figure out the answer. And of course, first we had to remove all the mentions of Mars bars and the Mars rover because that was massively overpowering the data. But here we go. Men are indeed more likely to talk about Mars. As for Venus, it was evenly split. Men and women talk about Venus the same amount of time. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. There are a couple of minutes left. I did go a bit long. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the question box and I'll have a peek at them. I do see one question which I think now I've actually gone over. They're asking about can we generalize these results to genders broadly? Yeah, as I said, the differences were slight. Sure, if I had, with sample sizes like these, anything is statistically significant. You could say men talk about these kinds of things more than women talk about these kinds of things. But the effect sizes were very small. These are more of interesting, good to know, good to think about as you walk into a set of data in front of you and start to read how men and women are writing. It's a good to know as opposed to a huge demographic difference between the groups. All right, it looks like questions may come later. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to join me. If you have any questions at all, you can email me at annie@peanutlabs.com. You can catch me on Twitter. I am LoveStats. You can catch me on Facebook or on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to link in with anyone in any kind of research, qual, quant, whatever it may be. So with that, I will wish you a delightful day and meet you perhaps next month at our next webinar. Thank you very much.